So, today I want to talk about homelessness and debt for children. Given the current state of affairs in the United States, especially when it comes to the effects of the pandemic and the fact that more and more people are being evicted from their homes due to the end of eviction moratoriums, we really do need to have a conversation about homeless children and the debt that children are incurring. Instead of worrying about the overblown and fictitious threats of the culture war, I wish that more adults would actually think of the children and deal with the reality and crisis that we have on our hands. It should be recognized as outrageous just how many students in our communities are without homes or proper shelter, and how many lack the funding to pay for things like school lunch. We should be striving for a society in which no one, especially children, are without homes and going hungry. Yet here we are. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on. We have an article here from Chalkbeat, New York. More than 100,000 New York City students are homeless, new report finds. We have here that about 101,000 students live in unstable or temporary housing during the 2020 to 2021 school year, according to an analysis of state data released Monday by Advocates for Children. That's nearly 1 in 10 children in the city of New York and that are in the public school system. And that is a larger number than the entire school district of Denver. That's how many children are actually in a state where they are in unstable or temporary housing. Accessing classroom and instruction, which is difficult for many children last year, was something sometimes impossible for homeless students and their families. Family shelters did not have Wi-Fi and are only now getting it, following a lawsuit from Legal Aid. Even students equipped with city-issued internet-enabled iPads struggled to log on for classes because shelters had spotty connections to cell service that those devices depended on. Now, I need to point this out there. A lot of places like New York City, a lot of the major cities, had some sort of program to make it so that students could do remote learning last year because of the effects of the pandemic. And the fact of the matter is, most of the shelters in these type of cities did not actually have proper Wi-Fi enabled systems. In addition to that, there's a lot of stigma around being in shelters. So a lot of people and children who needed to log in to these classrooms didn't necessarily want to have it revealed that they were living in shelters to their peers. And that's a lot of the difficulties that went into this, between the culmination of shame, the lack of infrastructure, and of course the lack of ability for some of them to even have access to the devices to get on to remote learning devices. Now, the thing is a lot of this was said, oh, well, the system isn't equipped for this. Yes, the system isn't equipped for it. So the solution wasn't necessarily to stop remote learning like a lot of people were advocating for, but the solution should have been to make it so that everyone did have the infrastructure. This should have already been prepared ahead of time, but it wasn't. Now, in a lot of this, we need to recognize that more than 3,800 of these students had no shelter and lived in cars, parks, or abandoned buildings, while another 200 students lived in hotels or motels, according to the Advocates for Children report. Another 28,000 lived in city shelters, while about 65,000 students lived doubled up with friends or family. Information was not available for roughly 3,900 students, the organization said. In addition to this, it is worth noting that because of the pandemic, it needs to be understood that all of these figures are probably low, given how many people were in remote learning, or how many students rather were in remote learning during this time. It's undetermined how many were actually in these type of situations, and it wasn't reported or discovered either by school counselors or by teachers. Additionally, schools may have faced more challenges in identifying where students lived because the majority of children chose to learn remotely, an issue that advocates also flagged last year. Homeless students were far less likely to show up for remote or in-person school last year, and that's for a lot of the reasons that I described before. Attendance rates were about 73% for those in temporary housing compared to those in the high 80s and low 90s for those with stable housing. That's about 10 to 14 percentage points less than those in stable housing. Now, for one particular mom that they spoke with during this, she struggled to simply enroll her son in preschool while moving between shelters and trying to find permanent housing. Now, one of the barriers here is that if you have your child in a program and you're bouncing between shelters, that's going to be really difficult. especially because you need to be able to get your child, the student in your life, to these school programs. So you need to have some sort of stable shelter or program, even if it is just this type of like shelter that people are living in. Now, this person was also dealing with the fact that, or this other person rather, was dealing with the fact that they had a 2-year-old son that they were trying to get into these programs while trying to navigate housing on using the phone because there was no computers available at the shelter. And because of the lack of internet and Wi-Fi, she ended up over on her data on her mobile plan. Sometimes she would even spend a huge chunk of the money that she received in public assistance to buy toys from Amazon that were meant to improve the child's motor skills. Because in this particular person's case, they had an issue where they needed something to help their child be able to develop motor skills. That's an important thing. And if you have a child with something like autism or developmental delays, that can make it even harder, as about 30% of these students in shelters have been identified to need special education services, compared to about 21% of permanently housed students, according to data obtained by Advocates for Children. And these are the type of situations that we're seeing in New York City, but that's far from the only place that this is happening. If we look at what's happening in a place like Memphis, Tennessee, we find that of students there that a lot of behavioral issues are starting to happen, and students are starting to disrupt classrooms more and more when they are in fact in situations where they are homeless. Having seen firsthand the ways homelessness hurts students academically, socially, and emotionally, Harris, a teacher in this system, is alarmed by the growing number of Memphis children experiencing housing insecurity. With 538 enrolled students identified as homeless as of September 29th, the number of homeless children in the Shelby County schools had jumped 36% from last fall, raising questions about how Tennessee's largest school district and the community can best support students and families in need. And this is just going to get higher as more and more people get evicted from their homes. This is not something that's going away on its own. In fact, between September 2020 and September of 2021, the nation's median apartment rent rose by 15% in the Memphis metropolitan area. The situation is even worse in Memphis, as they saw a 19% increase in rents, compared to the 15% across the rest of the country. Now, the district continues to do whatever it can to solve the problems, things like providing transportation, school supplies, uniforms, offering to allow for individual tutors in both schools and in shelters to go in. But the problem is that the funding is quickly getting exhausted because there's not enough to deal with the extent of this systemic problem. You have a lot of people who are in situations where families have been evicted multiple times, sometimes owing up to $10,000 in past due rent or mortgage payments, and in a lot of these families' cases, it's far from their fault. In July, actually, a program that they have in the Memphis metropolitan area, Metropolitan Interfaith Association, received 500 applications as of July for emergency assistance to help families stay in their homes and pay for utilities. However, by September, that had quadrupled to 2,000 families seeking assistance. And if a child doesn't receive education, then they may not be able to land a good job as an adult. And if they can't earn enough money to afford stable housing, then they also end up in a place where their children may experience homelessness. And this only perpetuates a cycle of poverty. Now, in addition to this, I think it's also worth noting that a lot of children in these circumstances are forced into positions where they have to work in order to help their families pay off bills. And as I've talked about recently, there are situations where a lot of families are in places where children are being forced to take jobs at 14 and 15 years old, often being paid lower and lower wages by a lot of restaurants especially, instead of these restaurants hiring adults to basically provide a living wage, at the least, for people. Now, the only way that children get out of this cycle is to ensure that everyone has the basics: food, shelter, clothing, and education. And as I say quite frequently on this channel, if you want people to be able to thrive, if you want to create a better society, you need food, shelter, and medicine as the basic necessities for people. If you can provide those for people, then people will be able to start from a fair and balanced place. and this is required, and this is an educator talking about this, how children need this at the beginning of their lives. Schools do their part to support students facing housing insecurity, and now it's on the public officials and community leaders to dig into the problem. And just like all of this, we also have a situation where it's affecting college students and student debt that affects college students, and the people who have student debt in the aftermath of college are an entirely different scope of issue that I could talk about. But you have a situation right now where California college students are sleeping in parked cars in order to go to school. California's Long Beach City College said that it's going to allow homeless students to sleep in their vehicles at the university's parking garage. They announced this safe parking program is meant to help unhoused students at the university and provide a safe space for them to go to park overnight. Now, these students should have a home to go to, just like all of the students that I've been talking about. But the unfortunate reality is, instead of solving the systemic problems in all of this, we've made choices to try to mitigate these responses. We've tried to fix a lot of the symptoms rather than dealing with and addressing the actual issues in place. People should have homes. Children should have safe places to go to. And it shouldn't be the situation where children have to rely on these programs in order to find protection. Children should already be in safe and secure homes so they actually have a chance to thrive and survive, and to go through and be, in the next generation, a much better part of society. Now, those students will have access to restrooms and Wi-Fi throughout the night and be able to use showers at the Pacific Coast campus during the morning hours. Now, again, I'm glad the program is doing that. I am in no way knocking this. This is fantastic. But the problem is that these students should, again, be in homes from the first place. They should have places to go. There shouldn't be this situation. And the fact that we don't want to address this on a systemic level and to provide shelter for people is what's creating a lot of these programs having to deal with the symptoms rather than the actual cure, which is to solve houselessness and homelessness. Now, a UCLA study from 2020 actually found that 1 out of 5 California community college students, out of 1 in 10 California State University students, and 1 out of 20 California University students experienced homelessness. The study also found that K through 12 students who experienced homelessness in the state have risen to 50% in the last decade. Risen to 50% in the last decade. That is an obscene amount of people who are dealing with this. Now, it's also worth noting that according to 2017, and this is probably a lot higher given the effects of the pandemic, 1 in 6 children were at risk for hunger. In the meantime, the solution for that has been to shame students who cannot afford lunch. There's no official estimate of the cumulative total of school lunch debt nationwide, but according to a survey of 1,500 school districts represented by the School Nutrition Association, median lunch debt rose from $2,000 to $2,500 per district between 2016 and 2018, and anecdotal stories from individual districts paint an increasingly concerning picture. Now, when we look at one of those examples, we find that lunch has actually been taken out of some students' hands, and that some students have actually been threatened to not even get a high school diploma because of their student debt. These are just some of the ways that students in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, have been shamed for having school lunch debt when they cannot afford school lunch, but do not meet the high threshold to qualify for free or reduced lunch programs. According to data provided by Bristol Borough School District, 212 students in the approximately 1,200 student district owe a total of $15,875. 75 students owe more than $50. In Bristol Township School District, 922 of the approximate 6,200 students owe a total of $113,000. 772 students owe more than $50, and in a 2019 article in the Bucks County Courier-Times spotlighted just how much this issue is affecting the county's schools. And this has been a major issue. The Philadelphia Inquirer has talked about this in extensive details, and we're finding that in a lot of these places, we're seeing these students shamed for having lunch debt. Imagine a high school cafeteria in which a student's meal is taken away and thrown in the trash right in front of his peers because his lunch account has an outstanding balance of $4.95. In another school, a student breakfast was thrown away due to a 30-cent debt. You had a lunch thrown away for 30-cent debt? Are you kidding me? That is ridiculous and absurd. The idea that this kid's lunch, which clearly probably cost more than the debt, was thrown out just to shame them, there's no other excuse than to, for that. There's no other justification than to shame the student. Give the child the food. You need food in order to thrive in school. And it's part of these programs on why a lot of breakfast and lunch programs were created in the first place, so that kids were able to thrive and potentially get out of poverty. You're not even giving kids a fighting chance in this capitalist system. And one school denied a child's breakfast, even though the child's mother told the school over the phone that she was on her way there to pay for it. These scenarios are just a few examples of lunch shaming, a practice in many schools that is intended to shame students and their parents into paying overdue meal bills to the school. And as a matter of fact, we've seen this in a lot of places, where education advocates say, for example, in the Montgomery County Public Schools, that a policy was created in order for students to get, quote, alternative meals, which would promote lunch shaming and inequity. The proposal would actually make it so that anyone who had more than $35 in lunch debt would actually get alternative meals, which was their solution to make sure kids were actually, fed and to deal with lunch shaming. So they'd get a sandwich instead of a hot meal. Of course, it's not very difficult for a lot of the students to see which one of their peers is getting a sandwich instead of the hot meal. And so additional shaming will commence. And when we're talking about all of this, there's so many parents out there that are worried about the ideas of the culture war and all of the stuff that the conservatives are throwing out there. And this is the lessons that they're seeing their kids learn, that it's okay to shame other kids because of the fact that they can't afford lunch, instead of just providing meals for children. And instead, these kids are going to have to work jobs. And a lot of people are fine with totally exploiting these children and paying 14 and 15-year-olds and putting them in debt and putting them in these circumstances where they have to pay for their lunches in order for them to get a high school diploma and actually graduate. And of course, a lot of these children are also supporting their families instead of the families being able to provide for the children. And with all of this, the families should have housing. And that's not being provided for because more and more people are getting kicked out of their homes because of circumstances that were beyond their control from the pandemic. Now, one example that I actually do want to highlight in all of this is the fact that a lot of public libraries across the country have actually moved to start eliminating fines. Because it doesn't take much, especially if you're in a shelter system or you're in a place where you're consistently moving from location to location, where you could end up in a place where, as a student, you could end up getting late fines accumulating on your library books. And a lot of places started noticing that a lot of kids were, especially in poor situations, who are in low-income housing, in a lot of these type of situations, could not actually afford the fines that they were incurring. And it starts off with, kids taking out 6-7 books. And it starts going to like 60 to 70 cents a day for some of the kids. Some places charge a quarter a day for debt for books. And if you have a quarter a day per book for 6 books, that's $1.50 a day. And if you're in a place where you're moving from shelter to shelter or home to home, that could accumulate very quickly into $5, $10, $15 that's no longer available and that you need for your own food and survival that you can't pay to the library. Let that accumulate over time from shame and other factors, then all of a sudden you end up with massive debt, and then you can't take out books from the library. It's not uncommon, and it happens quite often. Now, the public library is one institution in the community that should absolutely serve everyone. We never want to have a barrier to access because the library belongs to everyone. Wealthy, poor, documented, undocumented, those with homes, those without homes of all ages. When you really start talking to people about the reasons to go fine-free, increases to access, removing a barrier in many cases to families that need the library the most, it all pointed in the direction of making this decision. There's not a lot of funding that comes out of libraries. And so I actually applaud all of the libraries that have moved in the direction of getting rid of fines, because it's providing one more tool for people in, especially without homes, or who are in low income housing, or who are in situations where they need it, to be able to get access to books when they otherwise can't. Especially because being able to buy kids books is expensive, and it's not something that everyone has access to and can afford. Now, with all of this, I think it really does need to be said that this crisis really does overlap with a lot of the other stuff that I talk about on this channel. From the restaurants and businesses moving in the direction of hiring 14-year-olds, like I mentioned before, to the infrastructure crumbling and the fact that more and more people are in situations where they're finding themselves in areas where there's lead in the water supplies, to the eviction crisis and everything that I talked about with that, to the numerous other topics that I talk about on this channel. All of this is systemic, and all of this is intertwined. And all of these things are the effects of capitalism in full force, where nobody wants to pay for the externalities of the things that they benefit from. A lot of people tend to have a mentality of, I got mine, forget everybody else. But the fact of the matter is, we really do need to address all of this on a systemic level and make sure that families and children are actually in homes, and that people can actually survive in these times, especially with the pandemic, especially with everything else. People should, at the very base reality, be able to maintain and have food, shelter, and medicine. And they should be able to have adequate transportation to get to and from their employment. If we can't maintain that, then how can we even pretend that this is actually functioning as a society? And more people, because of the eviction moratorium, are ending up in a place where they are going to end up losing their home. And the people who are going to suffer the most are the children, because they're already in places, in many cases, where they're in food insecurity, where they're in housing insecurity, and where a lot of them don't even have homes. And that's going to affect their education, force them into early employment, and put people in places where, honestly, they cannot survive. And this is the type of society that we want to live in. This is the type of society that we want our children to feel like they are, learning from. This is the type of lesson that we want to teach kids about how to run a society. We can and should be doing better, and we need to create a better society for the next generation to thrive. Not where they are without food and homes, not where they're working low-wage jobs and struggling to survive, so that businesses can be propped up. All of this needs to change, and it needs to change soon and on a systemic level. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter, check out my Discord, and subscribe to me on Patreon. All of those links are in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Terra, and I thank you for watching.